1970, a soda company from Columbus, Georgia held something remarkable. 10% of the entire American soft drink market. Not a footnote, not a regional curiosity. The fourth largest cola company in the United States. Not Coca-Cola, not Pepsi, Royal Crown. For a moment in taste tests run across the country, people picked RC Cola over both giants. Housewives picked it blind. Soldiers picked it blind. Even Coca-Cola's own bottlers off the record admitted it tasted better. And then it was gone. Pushed off the shelf. Pushed out of memory. Reduced to a bottle you have to search for in a gas station cooler, next to brands nobody asks about anymore. This is not a story about a company that lost a taste test. RC Cola won plenty of those. This is a story about who owned the trucks, who owned the shelf space, and who, decades later, owned the debt that finally closed the doors. RC Cola survived. The company that built it did not. But the real story of Royal Crown Cola is not the story of a soda that lost a war of flavor. It is the story of who controlled the distribution routes, the retail shelves, and, in the final chapter, the balance sheet of a man who never sold a single bottle in his life. Capital decided this outcome, not taste. Every week, we tell the stories behind the American brands and companies that shaped the country's daily life. The ones that got bought, broken up, or quietly erased. If you want to keep hearing them, give this video a like and subscribe. The story begins in Columbus, Georgia, 1901. Claude Adkins Hatcher was not born to sell soda. He was born in 1876 in Quitman County, Georgia, the son of a merchant family that measured its success in flour barrels and feed sacks, not fizzy drinks. He trained as a pharmacist, a graduate of the University of Louisville School of Medicine, and for a time he ran two small drug stores of his own, one in Preston, Georgia, the other in his hometown of Dawson. By 1901, at 25 years old, Hatcher sold the Dawson store and moved to Columbus, Georgia, to join his father in the family wholesale grocery trade. Together with his father and two partners, he helped form the Cole Hatcher Hampton Grocery Company. Within 2 years, the Hatchers bought out their partners entirely. The business became simply the Hatcher Grocery Company, a family operation built on thin margins, dependent on whatever the big suppliers decided to charge that month. One of those suppliers was Coca-Cola. By the turn of the century, Coca-Cola was already the undisputed king of the American soft drink shelf, and the Hatcher Grocery Company carried it in bulk. It was reliable. It sold. It also came with a wholesale price the Coca-Cola Company's representative in Columbus was not willing to negotiate. Hatcher pushed back. The representative did not move. For most grocers, that would have been the end of it. A shrug, a higher price passed on to the customer, business as usual. Hatcher did something else. He pulled Coca-Cola off his own shelves. Then he went looking for a way to replace it. He did not have a factory. He did not have a laboratory. What he had was a basement beneath his family's grocery store, a pharmacist's training in mixing compounds precisely, and a grudge he was determined to turn into a product. Not in a boardroom, not with investors, in a basement, under a grocery store, with a man who was angry enough at one supplier to become one himself. In 1905, Hatcher had his first result, a ginger ale, sharper and more assertive than the drinks already on the market, which he named Royal Crown Ginger Ale. It was not an accident. It was the product of months of deliberate formulation, mixed and remixed in that basement laboratory until Hatcher was satisfied it could stand on its own against anything a national supplier could offer. He bottled it himself. He sold it through his own store first, then to neighboring grocers who had heard what the pharmacist downtown was cooking up. The response was immediate enough that Hatcher understood he was no longer just a grocer with a side project. That same year, he and his father formalized the operation, founding the Union Bottling Works, a company built for one purpose: to manufacture and bottle Hatcher's own line of drinks, independent of any supplier who could dictate terms to him again. By 1907, the growing business had outgrown its original space, and the Hatcher family's grocery operation relocated to a larger facility on 10th Avenue in Columbus, with the bottling works expanding alongside it. The market Hatcher had identified was not a mystery. Grocers across the South were tired of being price takers with a single supplier out of Atlanta. What none of them had was a pharmacist with the technical skill to formulate a real alternative, the grocery infrastructure to distribute it, and a personal reason to never stop trying. Royal Crown Ginger Ale was just the opening move. Hatcher was not interested in competing at the edges of the soft drink market. He wanted the center of it, the cola itself, the exact category where Coca-Cola could not be touched. What Hatcher didn't know, standing in that basement in 1905, was that this small operation, one ginger ale, one bottling line, one grudge against a syrup salesman, was about to become one of the fastest-growing bottling networks in the American South. By 1907, Hatcher had his cola. He called it Chero Cola, a cherry-inflected answer to Coca-Cola, built to be sold the same way, in the same size bottle, through the same grocery counters Hatcher already understood better than almost anyone in the South. It did not take long to prove itself. Within a few years, Chero Cola had become the best-selling product to come out of the Union Bottling Works, ahead of the ginger ale that started it all, ahead of every other flavor in Hatcher's growing lineup. In 1912, Hatcher formalized the shift. Union Bottling Works was reorganized and renamed the Chero Cola Company, restructured around a single purpose: manufacturing syrup concentrate and selling it to independently owned bottling plants across the region. This was the decision that turned a Columbus grocer's basement project into a national operation. Hatcher did not try to build factories in every city himself. He did not have the capital of a company like Coca-Cola, and he knew it. Instead, he sold the formula and the franchise rights to local businessmen, men who already had trucks, ice houses, and delivery routes in towns Hatcher had never set foot in. Each new bottler bought the syrup, added the water and carbonation locally, and paid Chero Cola a share in return. It was not a company chasing Coca-Cola's national footprint city by city. It was a company that let 300 small businessmen chase it for him, one franchise at a time. The strategy worked faster than almost anyone expected. By 1920, just 8 years after the Chero Cola Company's formal founding, the syrup was flowing to 700 franchise bottling plants across the country. 700 separate businesses, 700 separate delivery routes, all carrying Hatcher's name into towns that a single centralized company could never have reached on its own. But a machine built entirely on syrup sales had one exposed nerve: sugar. And in the early 1920s, that nerve was struck directly. The price of raw sugar, the single most important ingredient in every bottle Chero Cola's franchisees produced, began to climb. What had cost less than 5 cents a pound suddenly cost more than 30. For an industry running on thin per-bottle margins, this was not a rising cost. It was an existential threat. Soft drink companies across the country braced for what looked like a wave of failures. Hatcher did not wait for the crisis to pass. He calculated that raw, unrefined sugar would be easier to secure than the refined product every competitor was now bidding for at inflated prices. He traveled to New Orleans, bought industrial sugar refining equipment outright, and shipped it back to Columbus. Then he hired a qualified chemist to run it, bringing sugar refining, a process no soft drink company of Chero Cola's size handled in-house, directly under his own roof. It was not the move of a company hoping to survive the sugar crisis. It was the move of a company determined to control the one input its entire franchise network depended on. The gamble held the company together. But by the mid-1920s, a new problem was emerging. One sugar refining couldn't solve. The market for Chero Cola itself, the flavor that had built the 700-plant network, was starting to soften. Rather than defend a flavor that consumers were drifting away from, Hatcher made a decision that would have terrified a company with less control over its own bottling network. He let Chero Cola fade and pushed a new line of fruit-flavored sodas, Knee-High, into the same 700 plants that had carried his cola for a decade. Knee-High launched in 1924. Orange, grape, fruit flavors that had nothing to do with cola at all, sold through the exact same franchise infrastructure Hatcher had spent 12 years building. The bet paid off. Knee-High caught on fast enough that by 1928, the company changed its name once again, this time to the Knee-High Corporation, formally retiring the Chero Cola name from the top of the letterhead, even as bottlers kept the old cola on shelves alongside the new fruit sodas. It was not a company staying loyal to the product that made it. It was a company staying loyal to the distribution network and letting the product change underneath it. Then on December 31st, 1933, Claude Hatcher died in Columbus, Georgia. He was 57 years old. He did not live to see what came next. Leadership of the Knee-High Corporation passed to Vice President H.R. Mott, who inherited a company carrying real debt and a cola formula that had been quietly losing ground for years. Mott's first move was blunt. He set a goal of making the company debt-free within 12 months. His second move was more consequential. He ordered a full reformulation of the old Chero-Cola recipe and assigned the job to a company chemist named Rufus Cam. Cam worked on the new formula for 6 months. When it was finished, Mott made a decision that reached back to the very beginning of Hatcher's story, back to that first product to ever come out of the Columbus basement in 1905. He named the new cola not after the cherry flavor it was replacing, but after the very first line Hatcher had ever put his name on, Royal Crown. The relaunch in 1934 was an immediate sensation, proof that the 700-plant network Hatcher had spent 3 decades building could carry an entirely new product to national relevance almost overnight, as long as the distribution muscle underneath it stayed intact. It was not a comeback built on nostalgia for Hatcher's original formula. It was a comeback built on the machine he'd left behind, a machine that no longer needed him to keep running. Hatcher never got to see the name Royal Crown become a cola. He only ever knew it as a ginger ale, sold out of a basement to spite a man who wouldn't budge on a wholesale price. By the early 1930s, Royal Crown had a product. What it needed next was a reason for ordinary Americans to reach for it instead of the drink that was already sitting in almost every icebox in the country. The company found that reason not in a marketing department, but in a working-class ritual that had already formed on its own. Out in the towns Royal Crown's franchise bottlers actually served. It started with a bakery 300 miles away. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, a company called Chattanooga Bakery had been selling a graham cracker and marshmallow snack since 1917, sized, as the story goes, to be as big as the moon. They called it the moon pie. Somewhere in the depths of the Great Depression, in the cotton mills and sawmills and filling stations of the American South, 2 products that had never been designed to go together started showing up together anyway. A nickel bought a moon pie. A nickel bought a bottle of RC, 10 cents, and a working man had lunch. Enough calories and enough cold sugar to get him through the second half of a shift, with change to spare compared to a hot meal he couldn't afford to stop for. It was not a campaign. It was math a mill worker could do standing at a counter, and it caught on faster than any advertisement could have manufactured it. By the 1950s, the pairing had worked its way into the culture deeply enough to produce its own soundtrack. Country singer Big Bill Lister recorded a tune called Gimme an RC Cola and a Moon Pie, a song about a man broke enough to sell his calf for $1.50 and still able to afford the one small comfort that mattered, an RC and a moon pie and a train to catch. Royal Crown didn't invent the pairing. It didn't need to. What the company did was recognize it, lean into it, and let the working man's lunch become shorthand for exactly who Royal Crown was selling to. Not the executive with a Coca-Cola on his desk, but the man on the factory floor with a nickel in his pocket and 15 minutes to spend it. While the moon pie pairing built loyalty from the ground up, Royal Crown's leadership was reaching for something bolder to prove the brand's case at the national level. A direct, public challenge to Coca-Cola and Pepsi on the one ground, Royal Crown was confident it could win, taste itself. The result was the Best by Taste Test campaign, one of the soft drink industry's first large-scale blind taste tests, staged with the polish of a Hollywood production and fronted by public figures willing to put their name behind the comparison. The premise was simple and confrontational. Put RC Cola against Coca-Cola and Pepsi Cola, side by side, unlabeled, and let ordinary Americans pick a winner without knowing which glass was which. Royal Crown wasn't guessing. Company records and repeated public tests backed the campaign's claim. Blind, RC won often enough that the company built an entire advertising identity around it. You bet RC tastes best. It was a campaign no company with Coca-Cola's market position would ever have needed to run. Coca-Cola didn't have to prove it tasted better than its competitors. It only had to be everywhere its competitors weren't. Royal Crown, without that same shelf presence, without that same bottler reach into every corner store in America, had exactly one lever left to pull: quality proven in public, one blind sip at a time. The strategy worked precisely because Royal Crown had nothing to lose by inviting the comparison. Coca-Cola risked its reputation every time it accepted a challenge like this. Royal Crown risked nothing. It was already the underdog. All it needed was for one more grocery shopper, one more filling station customer, to try RC once and realize the lesser cola tasted just as good, sometimes better, for a lower price on the shelf. By the middle of the 20th century, Royal Crown had built something Coca-Cola and Pepsi could not easily copy: a genuine, working-class, Southern-rooted identity, proven in taste tests, sealed with a moon pie, and set to a country song. It was not the identity of a national giant. It was the identity of the underdog everyone in the small towns quietly rooted for. That identity would carry Royal Crown through the next great test facing the American soft drink industry, a test that had nothing to do with taste at all. In 1907, 2 years after Claude Hatcher bottled his first ginger ale in a Columbus basement, the state of Georgia did something no other state in the American South had done. It banned alcohol outright. Production, transportation, and sale, all made illegal in a single stroke. Georgia became the first southern state to go dry, more than a decade before the rest of the country would follow with national prohibition in 1920. For the saloons and breweries built on whiskey and beer, this was a death sentence. For a young company built on cola syrup and ginger ale, it was something else entirely. With legal alcohol gone from Georgia's shelves, soft drinks stepped into the space it left behind. A cold bottle of Chero Cola became the thing a working man reached for at the end of a shift, in a state where the drink he might once have reached for no longer existed. Hatcher's company didn't need to outmarket anyone to benefit from the shift. It simply needed to already be there, already bottled, already sitting in the cooler. And it was. When national prohibition arrived in 1920, the same pattern repeated itself across the entire country. The breweries that had defined American drinking culture for generations were forced to shut down, reinvent themselves, or fold entirely. Some pivoted to near beer. Some pivoted to ice cream. Many simply closed their doors and never reopened. The soft drink industry, by contrast, had no product to hide and no license to lose. Companies like Chero Cola didn't have to survive prohibition. They had to survive the sudden flood of new competitors rushing into the one beverage category still legal to sell. And that meant out-distributing them, plant by plant, town by town, exactly the strategy Hatcher's 700-bottler network had already spent a decade perfecting. Prohibition tested the entire American drinks industry on one single question: who already owned the shelf space when the rules changed overnight? Chero Cola did. That single fact, more than any formula or flavor, is why the company came through the 1920s larger than it went in. The next national test arrived 2 decades later, and it struck at something Royal Crown could not simply out-distribute its way around: the sugar supply itself. When the United States entered the Second World War, sugar became one of the first commodities placed under strict federal rationing, beginning in 1942. Every bottler in the country, Royal Crown's franchises included, was allocated sugar based on a fixed formula tied to prior usage. No exceptions, no matter how fast a brand was growing. For an industry entirely dependent on sugar to manufacture its product, this was not an inconvenience. It was a hard ceiling on how much cola or Nehi any plant could physically produce, regardless of demand. Royal Crown's answer was the same instinct that had carried it through the 1920s sugar price crisis: control what could be controlled and adapt the rest. Bottlers stretched allocations, adjusted formulas where regulations allowed, and leaned on the sugar refining capacity Hatcher had built into the company back in the 1920s. Infrastructure originally built to survive a price shock, now repurposed to survive a hard supply cap. The company came through both crises according to the same underlying pattern. Prohibition rewarded whoever already had the distribution network in place before the rules changed. Wartime rationing rewarded whoever already had control over their own raw materials before the shortage hit. In both cases, Royal Crown wasn't the biggest name in the industry. It was simply positioned in advance in exactly the right place to weather what came next. By the time sugar rationing finally lifted after the war, Royal Crown Cola had survived two of the harshest structural shocks the American beverage industry had ever faced. Not through invention, but through infrastructure it had already built for entirely different reasons. The company that emerged from the 1940s was leaner, more resilient, and about to enter the most innovative stretch of its entire history. By the middle of the 1950s, Royal Crown Cola was no longer just surviving the American soft drink industry. It was setting the pace for it. In 1954, Royal Crown became the first company in the country to sell a cola in a can. Not glass, not the fragile returnable bottles every household was used to hauling back to the grocery store, but a sealed tin can that could travel anywhere a truck could go. It was a small mechanical change with an enormous distribution consequence. Cans were lighter, cheaper to ship, harder to break, and easier to stock in places bottles never reached. Vending machines, gas stations, roadside coolers, far from any bottling plant. For a company that had built its entire history on out-distributing bigger rivals, the can wasn't just packaging, it was another lever for reaching towns Coca-Cola's bottling network hadn't bothered to prioritize. Royal Crown pushed the same instinct further with pricing. While competitors held the line on the traditional bottle size, Royal Crown introduced a 16-ounce bottle at a price that made the arithmetic impossible for a shopper to ignore. More cola for less money per ounce, sitting right next to the smaller bottle on the same shelf. It was not a subtle campaign. It was a nickel doing more work than a dime. Then in 1958, Royal Crown made its boldest move yet. It launched Diet Right, the first diet cola sold nationally in the United States, years ahead of Coca-Cola or Pepsi's own diet lines. Diet Right wasn't positioned as a medical product or a niche item for diabetics. Royal Crown sold it exactly the way it sold everything else, in the same slim bottles, at the same nickel price point, marketed to anyone who wanted a cola without the sugar. The sweetener behind it was a compound called Cyclamet, 30 times sweeter than sugar, cheap to produce, and critically tasting far closer to real sugar than the alternatives available at the time. The timing could not have been better. America was entering an era newly obsessed with calorie counts and waistlines, and Royal Crown had a diet cola on shelves before either of its giant rivals had one in development. For the first time in the company's history, Royal Crown wasn't playing catch-up. It was years ahead of an entire product category it had essentially invented. The results showed up in the numbers. By 1970, Royal Crown Cola held roughly 10% of the entire American soft drink market, enough to make it the fourth largest soda company in the country, trailing only Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper. For a company that had started in a Columbus grocer's basement out of a pricing dispute, this was the summit. 10% of a market that giants had spent half a century trying to dominate completely. But the very innovation that had carried Royal Crown to that summit was quietly becoming a liability. Cyclamet had never been fully settled science. Through the 1960s, a series of studies, some funded by interests with a direct stake in Cyclamet's biggest competitor, refined sugar, began linking the sweetener to tumors and birth defects in laboratory animals, at doses far beyond anything a human being would ever consume from a can of soda. The findings were disputed. The doses were extreme. None of that mattered once the headlines ran. In 1969, the Food and Drug Administration banned Cyclamet outright. Diet Right's entire formula, the sweetener that had made it taste closer to real sugar than anything else on the market, the exact thing that had let Royal Crown build a Diet Cola category years before its rivals, was suddenly illegal to sell. Royal Crown scrambled to reformulate, switching to alternative sweeteners that couldn't fully replicate what Cyclamet had done. But the damage went further than one product. The ban landed at the exact moment Coca-Cola and Pepsi were finally preparing to enter the Diet Cola category themselves. Well-funded, well-distributed, and no longer facing a Royal Crown product with a multi-year head start. The advantage that had taken Royal Crown to the top of the industry vanished in a single federal decision, just as its two biggest rivals were arriving to take the space it left behind. Royal Crown had reached the highest point in its history using an innovation nobody else in the industry could match. It would spend the next 2 decades finding out what happens to a company built on being first. Once the one thing that made it first is taken away by regulation it never saw coming. The 1970s did not treat Royal Crown kindly. With Diet Right's cyclamate advantage gone, and Coca-Cola and Pepsi finally fielding their own Diet Colas, backed by advertising budgets Royal Crown had never come close to matching, the company's 10% peak began sliding backward. Slowly at first, then with the kind of momentum that's hard to reverse once a shelf position starts eroding. What happened next was not a story of a company fighting to hold its ground. It was the opposite. During the 1980s, at the exact moment Coca-Cola and Pepsi were escalating what the industry itself came to call the Cola Wars, 9-figure ad campaigns, celebrity endorsements, saturation marketing on every television screen in America, Royal Crown pulled back. The company largely stopped advertising at national scale, at the precise moment its two biggest rivals were spending more aggressively than at any point in the industry's history. Bottlers noticed. Distribution networks that had once carried Royal Crown into small towns, Coca-Cola never bothered with, began declining to renew RC contracts, choosing instead to consolidate around whichever national brand was investing in shelf presence and promotion. Slowly, one franchise at a time, Royal Crown began losing the exact asset that had built the company in the first place. The 700-plant bottling network Claude Hatcher had assembled 2 generations earlier. It was not one bad decision. It was the compounding weight of an entire decade spent absent from a battlefield its rivals were fighting on with everything they had. Into this weakened company stepped a man named Victor Posner. Not a beverage executive, not a marketer, but a corporate financier known across American industry for a particular style of acquisition. Buy a company using heavily leveraged debt, extract value from its assets, and let the underlying business absorb the risk. Posner acquired Royal Crown in the 1980s, and one of his first structural moves told the whole story of what was coming. He relocated the company's headquarters away from Columbus and Atlanta, the city where Hatcher had mixed his first ginger ale, the region that had built RC's identity for 80 years, to Miami, hundreds of miles from the town the brand had always claimed as home. For nearly a decade, the Miami-run Royal Crown limped forward, carrying the debt structure Posner's acquisition had loaded onto it, while its market share continued eroding beneath the weight. In 1993, the plant tied to that Miami-era operation shut down entirely, as Posner's broader financial empire collapsed under the debt it had been built on for years. That same year, 1993, Royal Crown Cola Company was acquired by Triarch Companies, Inc., a conglomerate looking to consolidate a portfolio of beverage brands under one roof. For Royal Crown, it was the 4th ownership structure in under 2 decades, and the pattern was becoming unmistakable. Each new owner a little further from Columbus, a little less invested in the brand as anything more than a line item in a larger portfolio. The pattern accelerated from there. In October 2000, Cadbury Schweppes, the British confectionery and beverage giant, already the parent company of Dr. Pepper, acquired Triarch's entire beverage division, and Royal Crown came with it. For the first time in its history, the cola founded to spite a Coca-Cola representative in a Georgia grocery store was now owned by the same corporate structure as one of its longtime domestic rivals. The following year, in 2001, Cadbury Schweppes divided the brand along a border it had never recognized before. Royal Crown's U.S. operations stayed under Cadbury's American beverage arm, while its international rights, everything sold outside the United States, were sold off separately to Cott Beverages of Canada, reorganized under the name Royal Crown Cola International. A single brand, born in one basement, now answered to 2 entirely separate corporate owners, depending on which side of the American border it was sold on. In 2008, Cadbury Schweppes spun off its entire American beverage division into a standalone public company, the Dr. Pepper Snapple Group. Royal Crown's U.S. business moved with it. No longer Cadbury's, now DPSG's, still hundreds of miles and multiple corporate reorganizations removed from the Columbus basement where it started. 10 years later, in 2018, Dr. Pepper Snapple Group merged with Keurig Green Mountain, forming Keurig Dr. Pepper, the company that holds the U.S. rights to Royal Crown Cola today. On the international side, the brand kept moving through hands of its own. Cott sold Royal Crown Cola International to Refresco in 2021. Refresco, in the same transaction window, passed the international rights into a newly formed entity, RC Global Beverages, Inc. 2 years later, in 2023, RC Global Beverages was acquired by Mackay Holdings, a company based in the Philippines, on the opposite side of the planet from the Georgia storefront, where Claude Hatcher first bottled a ginger ale to spite a syrup salesman. 9 ownership changes, 4 different countries. A headquarters that moved from Columbus to Atlanta to Miami, and finally dissolved into a corporate portfolio too large to have a headquarters for RC at all. No single owner in this chain set out to destroy Royal Crown Cola. Each one, in turn, was simply managing a smaller and smaller piece of a much larger balance sheet. And each time the balance sheet needed managing, Royal Crown was the piece furthest from anyone's center of attention. The Miami plant that closed in 1993 was not the end of the story. It was the moment the story stopped being about a cola company at all and became a story about paperwork, debt, and a name that kept getting sold to whoever needed it least. In 1984, Victor Posner's holding company, Chesapeake Financial Corporation, took control of Royal Crown Companies. One of his first acts was symbolic before it was ever financial. He moved the company's headquarters out of Atlanta, the city that had anchored Royal Crown's identity since the Hatcher family first left Columbus, and relocated it to Miami Beach, folding Royal Crown into DWG Corporation, one of several holding companies under Posner's personal control. For 9 years, Posner ran Royal Crown from Florida. There were flashes of the old innovative instinct: Cherry RC, Diet RC, an 8-flavored Diet Right lineup, even a lawsuit against Coca-Cola and Pepsi, accusing them of pursuing anti-competitive market dominance. But underneath the new flavors, the marketing budget was being quietly stripped down, year after year, to feed the debt structure Posner's acquisitions were built on. Royal Crown kept losing shelf space to Coca-Cola and Pepsi throughout the late 1980s, and there was no advertising budget left to fight for it back. By the early 1990s, Posner's business empire was not just struggling. It was under federal investigation. Shareholders of his DWG holding company sued, alleging that Posner and his son had drained the business to enrich themselves while the companies underneath it, Royal Crown among them, were left to absorb the damage. In December 1993, a federal judge in New York, Milton Pollock, ruled on the case. He barred Victor Posner and his son from ever running a public company again, writing that Posner had shown open contempt for the interests of the shareholders who trusted him. There was no press conference at the Miami plant. No farewell shift. The ruling that ended Posner's control of Royal Crown was handed down in a federal courtroom 1,100 miles away, and the plant on the edge of what is now Miami's Wynwood Arts District simply stopped running not long after. I don't have a verified count of how many workers were on site at the Miami plant when it shut down, and I'm not going to invent one. The exact date and headcount rule this genre depends on only holds if both numbers are real. What's confirmed, the plant's operational life ran from 1984 to 1993, and the closure followed directly from Judge Pollock's December 1993 ruling against Posner. If you can source a headcount, I'll drop it straight into this paragraph. That same year, ownership passed to Triarch Companies under new leadership, Nelson Peltz and Peter May, who inherited a company that had just lost its headquarters, its Miami plant, and most of what remained of its marketing budget in a single year. Royal Crown Cola did not go out of business in 1993. It went out of Miami. The brand would survive, the bottles would keep shipping, the name would keep changing hands. But the version of the company that had once run its own sugar refinery, staged its own taste tests, and built 700 bottling plants from a Columbus basement was, by the end of that year, gone for good. What was left was no longer a soft drink company fighting for shelf space. It was a name on a balance sheet, waiting for whichever conglomerate needed it next. Today, Royal Crown Cola is owned by Keurig Dr. Pepper, the third largest soft drink company in the United States, the same company that owns Dr. Pepper, 7-Up, Snapple, and dozens of other beverage brands. RC Cola is one line among many inside a portfolio built through a century of mergers, and it shows on the shelf. You can still find it. It is not gone. But it is no longer the fourth largest cola in America, fighting Coca-Cola and Pepsi head-on. It is a regional legacy brand, present in some stores, absent in others, sold internationally through a separate ownership chain that now runs through a Philippine holding company thousands of miles from Columbus, Georgia. The precise language matters here. Royal Crown Cola did not cease to exist. It was not discontinued. It largely disappeared from national prominence, folded into a portfolio large enough that RC is no longer anyone's flagship product, kept alive more by loyalty and nostalgia than by any marketing budget fighting for new customers. But there is one place where none of that corporate history means anything at all. Every June, on the third Saturday of the month, the small town of Bell Buckle, Tennessee, population around 500, fills with visitors for the RC Cola Moon Pie Festival. It began in 1994, the year Moon Pie turned 75, when the town decided the anniversary deserved a celebration built around the pairing that had defined the working man's lunch since the Great Depression. 3 decades later, the festival is still running, a 10-mile race and a 5K kickoff the morning. There's a parade. There's the crowning of an RC Cola King and a Moon Pie Queen. And there is, every single year, the ceremonial cutting of the world's largest moon pie, sliced up and shared with a crowd that has, by mid-afternoon, grown far larger than the town itself. They are thinking about a cold bottle and a marshmallow sandwich cookie, the same pairing a mill worker in the 1930s could afford on a nickel and a nickel. In Columbus, Georgia, the Hatcher Family Cola Museum keeps that earlier chapter alive too. The basement laboratory, the dispute with the Coca-Cola salesman, the artifacts of a company that once believed it could out-taste and out-distribute anyone. This is the thesis this entire story has been building toward, restated now that the evidence is in. A corporation can buy the name, it can buy the recipe, the trademark, the formula for Diet Right, and the rights to Royal Crown Ginger Ale. What Keurig Dr. Pepper or Cadbury Schweppes before it, or Victor Posner before that, could never buy was Bell Buckle, Tennessee, on the third Saturday of June. They could not buy the memory of a nickel moon pie and a nickel RC at a Georgia Mills shift change in 1934. They could not buy a country song about a man who sold his calf for $1.50 and still had enough for one small comfort. Ownership of a brand and ownership of what a brand means to the people who grew up on it are not the same kind of ownership at all, and only one of them can be transferred in a corporate acquisition. It would be easy to tell this story as a story about a company that lost because its product wasn't good enough. The evidence doesn't support that ending, and this genre does not deal in easy endings. Royal Crown Cola won public taste tests against Coca-Cola. It was first to the can, first to the Diet Cola category, first with a genuine national blind taste test campaign. By almost any measure of pure product quality, Royal Crown held its own against giants for the better part of a century. What Royal Crown never had was Coca-Cola's capital. It never had the advertising budget to match Pepsi dollar for dollar during the Cola Wars. It never had a distribution network immune to a single regulatory ruling wiping out its best innovation overnight, or a corporate parent immune to a debt structure built by a man who'd never bottled a soda in his life. Royal Crown lost the way most American regional brands in this genre lose, not to a better product, but to a bigger balance sheet, a wider distribution net, and an ownership structure that, sale after sale, cared less about Columbus, Georgia, than the town that built the brand ever did. That is the real story of Royal Crown Cola. Not a taste test it lost, a capital structure it never had. Never. Somewhere tonight, in a gas station on the edge of a small southern town, a cooler door swings open, and a hand reaches past the national brands for a cold bottle of RC Cola. Somewhere in Bell Buckle, Tennessee, in a kitchen that still keeps a stash of moon pies in the pantry out of habit more than hunger, someone is pouring a glass over ice, the way their grandfather did after a double shift with a nickel in his pocket and nothing else to spend it on. They are not thinking about Claude Hatcher or a basement laboratory in Columbus, Georgia, or a pricing dispute with a Coca-Cola salesman in 1901. They are not thinking about 700 bottling plants or a taste test that once beat both giants of the industry or a diet cola sweetener banned overnight by the federal government. They are not thinking about Victor Posner or a courtroom in New York or a plant on the edge of Miami that went quiet in December of 1993, or a name that has changed hands 9 times since, passing through London, Toronto, and finally Manila. They are not making a statement. They have been doing this since before they can remember, since a